It is Easter this Sunday, and before we got to our leftover question from last week, I just wanted to do a couple Easter questions, and they're pretty common, but I have heard them often and enough. I think that people would appreciate them. And one is the length of time that Jesus was in the grave. Assuming he died on a Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. is what Scripture says, and he was buried by 6, which is when Passover would have began. How do we reconcile, over and over Jesus says he was going to be gone for 3 days and 3 nights, which is, again, if you count the Sunday morning, that's not really even like 2.5 days. So,
Right. There's been a couple of different ways that people have reconciled that. They've tried to move the date, and so said that Jesus died on a Wednesday, for example. But you still have the same kind of problems because if Jesus dies on a Wednesday,
okay.
he gets buried on a Wednesday. That night is Thursday, right? And then he's in the grave on Friday for a whole day, and then there's Friday night. That's 2 nights now, and then he's in the grave on Saturday for a whole day, and then you have a third night, but he gets up sometime during that night, but you don't have a full 3 days and 3 nights. And so
Right.
no matter what you do, you're not going to get 3 days and 3 nights. You're not going to get a full 3
Yeah,
days.
he would
and 3
have
nights.
to have risen from the dead or from the grave at nighttime if
Right.
it was a full 3 days and 3
Right,
nights,
exactly.
right?
Yeah. And so you're not going to get that. And one of the things that you have with the Jewish nation, 3 days and 3 nights is actually an idiom. And it's the idea. It's something that they use for anything that includes 3 days. And so when you're talking about the death of Jesus, there's a portion of Friday that is involved, and then you have Saturday that's involved, and Sunday starts at sundown on Saturday, and so that's the third day. The other thing that you can see is the way that the Jews understood it, and so Jesus, when he was talking to these guys in just about every instance where Jesus is talking about being in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, he's specifically talking to the Jewish nation or to the Pharisees. And if you look in Matthew chapter 27, if you look at verse 62, it says, "On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, 'Sir, we remember while he was still alive that how that deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise."'" So they're using that phrasing,
Right.
"After 3 days I will rise." And normally you would go, okay, so that would be after 3 full days.
Right.
And then look at what they say. He says, "Therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day." Well, it would be to the 4th day.
Right.
And so they know the idiom.
Gotcha.
Yeah, they know what they're talking about. And so lest his disciples come by night and steal him away and say to the people, and he's risen from the dead. And so the idiom is revealed in just the understanding of the chief priests and the Pharisees when they come and talk to Pilate.
Right.
And so that's something that's common in the Old Testament. When you talk about, there's an example of Joseph in the book of Genesis that goes all the way back to Genesis.
Okay.
And so 3 days over and over, you can have that term 3 days, and it's any part of 3 days. So the tradition that Jesus died on a Friday is radically. It is one of those things that you see throughout church history. You just don't have anything else.
Right.
And so, plus the next day is a Sabbath.
Right. And then I guess a question that kind of goes along with that, which was brought to my attention a few weeks ago. We were at a service and they were going through Exodus 12, and the pastor answered it, but he did it very brief, and I don't know that he did it justice. But basically, the question was in Exodus 12, you have the whole tradition of Passover and the bringing of the lamb into the home, and he was expounding on that, and basically that would have been on Palm Sunday. And I'm sure you even taught about this on Sunday, but the lamb coming into the household, and then Jesus is taking Passover with his disciples on Thursday night,
Right.
and they're killing the lamb at Thursday at twilight. But why? I guess the question became, if Jesus was the Passover lamb, he was basically dying Passover, which would have been the next day. And so how do you reconcile? Does this make sense? Like the
Right.
whole lamb thing with him being the lamb, yet him eating the same lamb. How does that work? I
Right.
guess.
This is how this goes. What people want to do is they want to make Jesus sacrificed on the. They want Jesus' sacrifice to take place at the same time that the lambs are being sacrificed in Jerusalem.
Right. That's what
the
they want to
problem.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they want to do. And so if you're going to do that, then you immediately have problems with what the text says, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke make it really clear that what Jesus was celebrating was a Passover.
Right.
And so the way that the Passover goes is the lambs are picked on the 10th. You keep them in your house for 4 days till the 14th. And then they begin sacrificing the lambs on the 14th before sundown.
Right.
And then they actually eat Passover on the 15th, because at sundown that's the 15th. So that's the day that that Passover actually takes place. And so people will come up with, well, maybe there were two Passovers. Maybe you had a Galilean Passover.
Right. That's actually that was this guy's explanation, which I was like,
Yeah. And so a Galilean Passover versus Jerusalem Passover. And but the only thing that you could come up with where they would make a distinction between those two would be between the Galileans and the Sadducees, because the Sadducees had some different dates than the Pharisees, for example. But we don't have any record of there actually being, two different Passovers.
Right.
It's nothing but conjecture. One of the problems that comes up with this is in the Gospel of John. It talks about the fact that the Jews did not want to come into Pilate's house because they wanted to eat the Passover that evening. Let me find this passage. It says this is in John chapter 19, and it says, now it was the preparation, or excuse me, that's not what we want. Okay, chapter 18, verse 28. It says, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Okay, and so what happens there is you have a conflict between that passage and the passages in the what are called the synoptic gospels that talk about Jesus eating the Passover meal, that it was Passover when that was taking place. And the conflict is taken care of by knowing something about the Jewish law and what was being called Passover.
okay.
So Passover is not just the meal, and it's not just the day. It's the whole period of time that includes the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the Jews called the day of Passover. They called the feast itself, the Seder, they called that Passover. And all the way through that whole week, that was called Pesach. It was the time of Passover. And so if you understand that, then you have some more options there. We're not just talking about one day. We're not just talking about one meal. The other thing is that there is a special meal that took place on the day that the Passover was eaten. And this is what I mean by that. Passover was eaten on, so Passover, when they sacrifice the lambs, is the 14th. At sundown, that's the 15th of Nisan. And that's when they're eating the Passover meal, the evening meal. The next day, there's another special meal that you could partake of, and you're still on the same day that you're eating the Passover meal. It's still the 15th. And so you could take part in that meal, but that was a meal that if you were going to eat from it, you had to sacrifice it yourself, and you could not be unclean on that day. And here's a distinction: you could go into a Gentile's house on the 14th of Nisan, and you would be clean to eat the Passover that evening because it ends the day.
Gotcha.
Okay, so you could have somebody else go and do your sacrifice your sacrifice for Passover. So say we're having Passover together, and I go, dude, I got to go over to the tanner's shop,
Right.
and so I can't go sacrifice the Passover. Will you sacrifice it for me? And then I go to the tanner's shop, and I may be ritually unclean, but only till sundown, and then I can come over and we can eat Passover together.
Okay.
But in the ceremony on the 15th, if I'm going to eat of that meal, I have to be the one that offers it. And so I have to, on that day, be ceremonially clean so that I can eat it that evening. I can't have you go do it for me.
Right.
And that's most likely what's being spoken about in that passage.
Well, I think you could that what you just said made a lot of sense, because that passage right there speaks to the fact that these guys are worried about being unclean. But if it's the Passover is that evening, then they'll be clean anyway. So
Right.
what's to worry about? So
Yeah,
something else
exactly.
is going on there, regardless. Of,
Yeah,
and
they wouldn't be doing this stuff on the day that they're offering up the Passover sacrifice in that sense.
Right.
Yeah. So they, although that second meal is something that they consider to be holy, it wasn't as intense as the Passover itself. But there were rules about that, and so that all that, by the way, is out of Edersheim, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah.
Okay.
And so that was dealt with, like 150 years ago. So, and it's a good answer.
It's
It's a better one than making up a second Passover meal that doesn't do it. The problem with that people have with that is that you don't have Jesus literally sacrificed at the same time that the Passover lamb is sacrificed, and so at that point, it's like I like that typology. I like that whole picture, but kind of what's more important, Jesus having his last Passover with his disciples, or
him keeping to the type, and
Right,
maintaining that.
yeah. And so in any case, that whole period of time is called Passover.
Okay, that's good.